First of all, I'd say with respect to the current administration and transformational leadership, you could define transformational leadership perhaps as a leader who finds himself either in a position to have to change the way a nation thinks about something because of outside events that have been imposed on him, or it could be a leader who sees the change that needs to be made and then has to persuade his fellow countrymen to follow. So both of those can be transformational situations. I think George W. Bush is a transformational leader. He had events thrust on him on September 11th and has sought to persuade, to lead and persuade the United States to follow a certain path. I believe the next president is going to be a transformational leader for a completely different reason, which is that we are now in a maybe even a post-September 11th period where some of the issues we're facing are very large, they're global, they're multinational. We're going to have to be thinking about things in a different way, and it's going to be the job of this president to identify the change that needs to be made and to persuade and bring the country along because of the ideas that that particular president has. This is going to be a very big challenge, I think, and what I'm struck by in this campaign is how much of the vocabulary that's being used is even Cold War vocabulary, not even post-Cold War vocabulary. And now we're in yet a new phase. So I'm watching the vocabulary of these candidates very carefully because that's going to give us a hint as to how they are going to frame the arguments for this change that everybody agrees we need. Yeah, I'd like to make a, I'm intrigued by this idea of using these closed-circuit communications tools for the commander-in-chief to directly interact with his people in the field, but probably most specifically the military commanders. This is clearly, or I should say possibly, a function of the way we think about things today, but certainly during World War II, I think it's surprising the extent to which the generals were sent out to do their jobs. I don't know if anybody's ever read Eisenhower's command orders. I mean, they're like 2 sentences, you know, beat Nazi Germany, period. Go figure, you know, go figure out how to do it. And he had remarkably little interference from Washington in this respect. I think there's another wonderful story about Winston Churchill, who just before the invasion of Normandy decided he wanted to come on shore on D-Day, arrive on a British ship of some sort, and Eisenhower was so concerned about it, he figured out how to get the King of England to tell the Prime Minister that he was needed in London. The point is that, I mean, this is what we're talking about in some sense about leadership, is that during times of war, I think Eisenhower wrote on this, that leadership has to take place at all levels. And it may be that the decider-in-chief is deciding too much, and that there is a form of micromanagement on the way to trying to bring about some kind of you know, implementation. I think it's a fascinating subject. The only other thing I would add to this particular idea is that Dwight Eisenhower had the interesting experience in terms of what Joe Nye calls a contextual intelligence of actually being in a military commander where you give orders and they're taken, to moving into the civilian political culture, where, as Brent points out, just because you said it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And I think this is there aren't too many modern examples of somebody's had to play both of these roles. And I think at the end of the day, what he figured out how to do, I think most successfully, was to learn how to control himself. You know, this is something that we don't talk about too much, but you can deploy all these great theoretical ideas. The truth is, at the end of the day, if you're not reliable, if you're impetuous, or you don't have personal control over yourself or kind of internal discipline, people are very destabilized by that. And I think he was probably, at the end of the day, a genius at knowing when to suppress his ego and when to deploy it. And so I often tell people when I'm talking to groups of people interested in leadership, start with yourself. Dwight Eisenhower is a man with a passionate nature who was tutored by his mother to learn to gain control over his soul. He who conquereth his soul is greater than he who taketh a city, she told him once after he beat his head against a tree and drew blood. And you know, that had a huge role in his life, so that he had all kinds of personal techniques for gaining control over himself before he went into a difficult situation, leading him to write Mamie Eisenhower during the war that remaining optimistic at all times was the single most important thing he had to do, because attitude of a leader is tremendously infectious. So I think that, you know, any of these factors can play a role in effective implementation, especially if the commander-in-chief, who is the decider-in-chief, you know, just depending on how those conversations go. I think it's a area of fruitful new study, I think.
If he ducked the mistake, maybe he wouldn't have learned so much.
I'd like to add one other thing. It's fascinating to me how our notion of what a strong leader is has changed. The current president often defines being a strong leader as staking out a position and not moving from it. I mean, I think one of the, again, stunning things about reading the history of World War II is how many compromises were made to reach the strategic objective. Compromises that would, by contemporary definitions, be regarded as folding your tent. I think part of it is because we don't think strategically anymore. We don't know what our long-term strategy is for this country or for many of our relationships overseas. So if you don't know what your long-term strategy is, you don't know whether you're making unnecessary compromises or not. And I guess something that goes hand in hand with that is this whole notion of being tough. I mean, we're talking today in this election like we were in the middle of the Cold War or something. I have to keep kind of scratching my head on this. We're using all the vocabulary that you would use if you were facing down major state actors, when in fact what you're talking about, if we're talking about terrorism here, are small numbers of people. We hope getting smaller, but terrorists, after all, are newly minted or can be newly minted. And so much of this, back to this vocabulary, just watch this vocabulary, because what we realize is that, you know, we have taken a little lessons from the Cold War, a few lessons from World War II, a few, and we've cobbled them together into something that's really quite different.